So you mentioned something there I'm going to key on just because it reminds me of why I hated the X Files after a certain time and why Fringe got terrible really quickly. Part of what made the X Files awesome was essentially it was a monster of a week adventure show for most of the show's run. The issues always crept in when they started paying more attention to the overarching storyline. Like when you just hint at there's more to going on, everything functions beautifully. Let the episode be the episode, it's its own story, and maybe there'll be like little bits and like pieces of things. But the minute, like, and I want to say it's like from episode or season 2 to 3 of Fringe, they decided to go whole hog on this alternate universe thing. And it's like, I really prefer the show when it was a monster of the week show. I had self-contained episodes. I could just really like an episode, really not like an episode. And then you start focusing, everything becomes subservient to this greater plot. And it just kind of, to me, it just certainly doesn't work in television. Like, even when I think of books, like, you've got the Dark Tower series by Stephen King, this big, long, arcing narrative that's going on. But what makes it good is like the overarching narrative is just kind of like there. You know that it's going somewhere because it's in a book series mostly, and he'll hint to little pieces of the broader story. But he does that in all of the other books of his like world too. Like, so it's like, what books aren't part of the Dark Tower story? At this point, I can't think of one. Like, there's, you're pulling in Dr. Callahan or what is it, the Father Callahan from the Salem's Lot into the story in like book 6 or 7. So it's like, though it's I like things that tie together but aren't slave to some overarching narrative. They have their own life to themselves. So the idea of that as a short story, like, it's like that feels to me like the way it's supposed to be done. Like, hey, there's a loose something here, figure it out for yourself.
Yeah, that was a thing we were kind of playing around with in Pulp Rev for a while. Raul Nyanzi did one called "The Perils of Sasha Reed," which is a kind of intergalactic story of a race girl who gets caught up in precarious situations and always has to fumble her way out of it and in strange ways. But he would put out like a bunch of stories in a collection, and they're all like connected to each other, but only in the sense that it's an overarching thing. But you can read them all standalone, and they perfectly were perfectly fine. And I like that idea, and I kind of hope that is what ends up taking off more in the future. Because I also don't like those sorts of stories where you're enjoying it and all of a sudden we're going to focus on this one thing to the exclusion of
Ugh.
everything else, and then it just gets boring.
Well, it's like, I can't remember what it was, back in the day, like, with Lovecraft, like, there were a lot of other writers that decided that they really liked that Cthulhu mythos, and then they'd start like incorporating elements of it. So it's like, okay, now we're kind of positioning these things in a universe that you don't really have anything to do with each other necessarily, but there's this idea that you kind of place them together because of this one little thing that ties them together in a small way. That's, to me, just way more interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I just like I don't even remember where that came from. Like originally, I think we were talking about serials and then standalones, and people were going on about how come nobody does a standalone anymore, or how come everybody does a serial, but it's always like delving into one thing. And then I think we eventually came to the conclusion that, well, you can kind of have them both because you can kind of have an overarching idea, but you can also keep that idea and tell any story you want as well on top of it. And I think that's more interesting.
Well, it's like more of like a appreciate having an overarching theme than like an overarching story.
Yeah, like that.
So now, in the time that you've been doing this, I'm curious, what are the things that you have found for you have been the most useful when it comes to building an audience or keeping, for me, which all boils down to keeping communication with your audience. I will note that really the thing that drew me to you on Twitter, is where I discovered you, is you have a lot of interesting thoughts on things that have nothing to do with writing. In particular, your music posts always fascinate the shit out of me because you just like a very, very wide variety of musics from all sorts of ages.
Yeah. Yeah, I just like I've I remember back when I started, because when you start, you're on your own. No matter who you are, you just have to figure out how to reach an audience. And I'm just sitting there with a book going like, okay, what am I supposed to do with it? I can't just go up to people and say, I have a book, read the book, because that's obnoxious and nobody's going to do that. But at the same time, I don't really want to do that, because I don't just want to treat an audience like an economic unit, for lack of a better term. The whole point of art is to communicate. It's back and forth. So I like to use social media as a way of just communicating with people, learning what people like, sharing what I like, maybe learning new things. And sometimes you get ideas or join groups that have similar ideas or new ideas you never thought of. So it's a nice mix. And I think the best thing that ever happened to me as a writer was originally finding the whole Pulp Rev group, because we're still around the same, a lot of the same people. We still talk about stuff. We still share ideas. We still encourage each other, and we're still putting out stuff, and we're meeting new people as well. That's one of the reasons the whole Iron Age thing coming up was nice to see, because it was good to see other people also getting into this sort of thing.
And to me, it harkens back to one of the things that with my client base and with the podcast, and I've always tried to harp on, and it's funny that I harp on it because and every author I talk to says pretty much the same thing: is that it's relationship building, like the thing that's going to help you no matter what. And it's either with the relationship you build with your customers, the people that read your books, or the relationships you build in the industry. Those are the things that are going to separate the men from the boys, separate the wheat from the chaff, whatever. If you put the time in to build the relationships with people, that's what's going to take you next level.